After liberation, France sought to create a story of triumph that placed the resistance at its center.
When the war ended, de Gaulle immediately began what became known as the resistance myth. And that is that the vast majority of the French people had combined to resist German occupation, and that only a small and insignificant minority had collaborated. And that's not true.
The reason for de Gaulle's narrative was France was defeated, it was humiliated, it was divided, it needed to rise from the ashes, and it needed a story, a good story, to tell itself.
But the story of the resistance was more complex than the myth suggested. Less the story of French resistance than of the resistance in France.
In fact, the so-called French resistance is full of Spanish Republicans, Polish, Hungarian and Romanian Jews, Italian anti-fascists, and indeed German anti-Nazis, who are quite prominent in the French resistance. So it's a much more diverse, multicoloured, cosmopolitan story than the one that's often told.
Not all who joined the French resistance were French, and not all French men and women joined the resistance. Some had endured occupation and focused their energy on survival.
As the war went on, everyday survival was increasingly difficult in France. Some areas at the end of the war were suffering food shortages. In Paris, for example, by 1942, the meat ration was cut by 75%, the bread ration by 50%.
Some who actively collaborated in the Holocaust sought to silence their story after the war.
The fact that Vichy had a role in the deportation of Jews from France, not only foreign Jews, but also a lot of French Jews who were caught up in the deportation. And this was a big roundup of Jews in Paris in July 1942, and they were housed in this cycle stadium called the Vélodrome d'Hiver. And from there they went to Drancy, which was a kind of holding camp in a housing estate on the outside of Paris, and then they went to Auschwitz. And the French police, was responsible for rounding them up.
Despite attempts to conceal collaboration, people thought to have collaborated with the German occupiers were openly attacked in the streets of France.
At the immediate end of the war, there was a period of about 2 weeks when there was summary justice, when a lot of French people essentially took revenge on others who had collaborated or mistreated them. And perhaps about 10,000 people were killed in what was called the purification at the end of the war.
But then, de Gaulle was very keen to get this under control, and courts were set up to deal with collaborators. And again, the distinction was made between economic collaboration and political collaboration. So, for example, if you were a factory owner or a manager of a plant which had worked with the Germans, you could probably get away with it. Political collaboration was not excused, and actually intellectual collaboration was clamped down on.
Women accused of collaboration were often targeted for public humiliation and acts of brutality.
There was a tendency to single out women who had had relationships with German soldiers, easily identified. Sometimes they were disfigured, had ears cut off, had their head shaved, or were tarred and feathered. But they were easy victims.
The aftermath of total war divided France for years to come. The population and the collective memory of the nation struggled to reconcile the actions of those who had resisted and those who were seen as collaborators.
I think there is a long-term effect, which is what you might call a divided memory. Although, as it were, the good is won and the resistance story won, there were still large numbers of people who felt that if they had supported Vichy, they had done the right thing.
The work of the resistance was not remembered fondly by everyone in France.
There's another distinction, which is a divided memory at the level of villages where there'd been massacres as a result of resistance activity. There was still, for a long time, a kind of a tension between the resistors who were saying, yeah, we did a great thing, we killed these Germans, and then the survivors of families whose parents have been shot, whose brothers and sisters have been shot as a result of German collective reprisals.